the most powerful empire in human history, lasting over 1,000 years, without a single public school, without a ministry of education. 900,000 people lived in the city of Rome, and not one school was opened by the state, not one teacher was paid by the state. And a Roman politician named Cato called Socrates the greatest philosopher of Greece, a shameless babbler who deserved to die. So why did such a vast empire have no desire to educate its people? Why did they treat knowledge as a danger that needed to be controlled? The answer is surprisingly simple. Rome didn't need smart citizens, they needed obedient citizens. And those are two very different things. The Romans had a famous phrase to describe the ideal citizen: vir bonus dicendi peritus, meaning a good man skilled in speaking. Not someone who knows a lot, not someone who thinks well, but someone who says the right thing at the right time to the right people. They called it mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. Everything from education to law was aimed at one goal: absolute obedience. The three pillars of Roman education were Pietas, meaning duty, Disciplina, meaning discipline, and Gravitas, meaning seriousness. There was no room for curiosity. These three pillars didn't teach people what to think. They taught people whom to obey, and, more importantly, never to ask why they must obey that person. Education in Rome was a family matter. Fathers taught their sons to plough, to fight, and to submit. The wealthy hired private tutors to teach at home. The Romans had a concept called patria potestas, the absolute authority of the father. Children were not individuals, they were the father's property. If you compare, Roman education resembled Sparta more than Athens. Both saw obedience as the most important virtue of a citizen. Athens taught philosophy, mathematics, the arts, and encouraged debate. Rome taught submission, rhetoric, and the laws of the state. That was the entire plan. No need for critical thinking, just obedience. No need for creativity, just order. And that plan worked remarkably well. So well that the empire lasted over 1,000 years, controlled nearly the entire Mediterranean, and became the greatest empire of the ancient world. But the story doesn't end there, because something very interesting happens when you ban thinking. Thinking finds another way to sneak in. With that plan in hand, Rome began to expand, and their army crushed every opponent from west to east across the Mediterranean. They conquered Greece, swallowed Egypt, swept across North Africa. Roman territory stretched across 3 continents with no sign of stopping. But here's a striking number. 1/3 of Italy's population at the time were slaves, roughly 300,000 to 350,000 people in Rome. And many of those slaves were teachers. Rome's first teachers were not free citizens, they were Greek slaves. Here's a rather ironic paradox. Greek slaves were often far more educated than the very Roman masters who owned them. The Romans called them paedagogus, literally meaning the one who leads the child. Slaves escorted children to class, served as nannies, and worked as tutors. It wasn't until 70 AD, under Emperor Vespasian, that Rome had its first state-paid teacher, Quintilian. But what did Quintilian teach? Rhetoric, the art of speaking well and persuading. Not mathematics, not astronomy, not natural science. The Roman education system had 3 levels. Ludus for basic instruction, Grammaticus for grammar, and Rhetor for rhetoric. There was no science. Children aged 7 to 11 studied at the Ludus Literarius, learning, reading, writing, and arithmetic. The teacher, called a ludi magister, earned low wages and held low status. The entire system had one single goal: to produce people who spoke well, obeyed, and were ready to serve the Roman state when called upon. And it worked. The empire rose. The Pantheon was built. Roads and bridges were constructed. Aqueducts stretched across the empire like living arteries. But now listen to this story. There was a man named Livius Andronicus, born in the city of Tarentum, captured as a slave in 272 BC. Tarentum was a prosperous Greek city in southern Italy. The Roman army marched in, destroyed the city, and enslaved the entire population. Livius was brought to Rome, and he did something remarkable. He translated Homer's Odyssey into Latin, creating what became a textbook. The Odyssey tells the story of Odysseus crossing the seas to find his way home. Livius had also lost his homeland, just like Odysseus, but he would never return. Think about that. A slave sat teaching his enslavers how to read and write, using the very work that told the story of his own longing for home. Eventually, Livius was freed thanks to his talent. But what does freedom mean when your hometown has been leveled to the ground and nothing remains? The poet Horace summed it all up in one famous line. Conquered Greece, conquered its barbaric conqueror. That is one of the finest summaries in all of human history. The victor on the battlefield became the student of the vanquished. Greek knowledge began flowing into Rome like an unstoppable current. Philosophy, mathematics, science, art, all of it poured into Rome. And the Roman aristocracy hired Greek tutors to educate their children, while simultaneously looking down on the very people teaching their children. So what happened when Greek knowledge didn't just flow into wealthy homes, but began spreading through the streets and seeping into the minds of the youth? In 155 BC, 3 of Athens' leading philosophers came to Rome as diplomatic envoys, and everything started to unravel. The 3 were Carneades, Diogenes of Babylon, and Critolaus. They came on diplomatic business, but then they began lecturing publicly in Rome. Carneades was a skeptic. On the first day, he argued in favor of justice. The very next day, he argued the exact opposite. That was the technique of critical thinking, teaching people to examine every issue from multiple sides. And that was precisely what the Roman system feared most. Young Romans were captivated. They abandoned their work, skipped their training, and flocked to the public square to hear the 3 philosophers lecture from morning to night. For the first time in their lives, young Romans were exposed to a dangerous idea, that everything they believed might be completely wrong. Cato was terrified. He told the Senate that if the youth kept listening to philosophers, they would drift from the law and stop obeying. Cato stood before the Senate and declared bluntly that these men were dangerous, that they were teaching Roman children the worst thing of all, doubt. Cato persuaded the Senate to resolve the diplomatic matter as quickly as possible and immediately expel all 3 philosophers from Rome before it was too late. That was the pivotal moment. The moment Rome stood at a crossroads, free thinking on one side, absolute obedience on the other, and they chose. And the frightening part is, they didn't choose out of ignorance. They understood the value of philosophy. It was precisely because they understood it that they feared it, and precisely because they feared it that they banned it. But free thinking doesn't die that easily. It doesn't disappear. It quietly hides within individual souls, waiting to resurface when it can. And here is something no one expected about Rome's greatest emperor. The man who ruled the empire at the height of its power for nearly 20 years. Marcus Aurelius, at 12 years old, dressed himself in a rough Greek cloak, slept on the bare ground, and lived as an ascetic like a true Athenian philosopher. His mother had to beg him to sleep in a proper bed. A royal boy who chose to live in hardship not because he was forced, but because he wanted to understand. Imagine that. A 12-year-old boy choosing to live like a Greek philosopher right in the heart of the empire that had expelled Greek philosophers 200 years earlier. Later, when he became emperor, he wrote meditations in Greek, not Latin, on the battlefield by the banks of the Huron River. Meditations was never written for anyone to read. It was the personal journal of the most powerful man in the world, written in the language of the conquered. The last great emperor of Rome, ruler of the largest empire on earth at the time, thought in the language of those his empire had subjugated. Free thinking survived, right beneath the shell of obedience. It didn't vanish, it simply found refuge in the soul of an emperor. But Marcus Aurelius was the exception, not the rule. One individual can be free in his mind, but that cannot save an entire system. The proof, after Marcus Aurelius died, his son Commodus took the throne. No philosophy, no thinking, nothing but pure violence. The system had won. The exception passed away, the rule returned, and from that point on, the Roman Empire began paying the price for the choice made in that public square long ago. Not a single new mathematical theorem. In over 1200 years of existence, the Roman Empire did not contribute a single mathematical discovery. Greece had Euclid, Archimedes, Pythagoras, Eratosthenes, dozens of minds that changed the world. Rome had its army, its roads, and not a single one, not because Romans were less intelligent, but because their education system never taught anyone to think scientifically or to ask questions. And here's the irony. The Pantheon, the aqueducts, the roads, the sewer systems, all the achievements Rome boasted of were built on science. But that science came from Greece. Rome excelled at application, but not at invention. They built with existing formulas, but never created new ones. And their education system deliberately excluded science. Britannica writes that the spirit of independent research was entirely foreign to the Roman mind. In the most literal sense, the spirit of independent inquiry, asking your own questions, finding your own answers, was alien to the way Romans were raised. When old formulas were no longer enough to solve new problems, no one in the empire knew how to create new formulas, because no one had ever been taught how. And here's the most ironic part. Cato, the man who expelled the Greek philosophers, was himself fluent in Greek. He had taught himself from the historian Thucydides. Yet that same Cato called the Greeks a corrupt race and forbade his own son from having any contact with Greek culture whatsoever. He benefited from Greek knowledge himself, but barred the next generation from accessing it. That is the kind of irony history repeats in every era. Just like a generation that used social media to build their careers, then turned around and banned the next generation from it out of fear of addiction. Benefit first, then shut the door. The system could no longer adapt. When the world changes and no one knows how to think differently, the empire weakens from the inside out. This is just like Sparta. Both empires collapsed not because their enemies were too strong, but because they themselves were too rigid to change. Sparta fell after the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC. A perfect but rigid system, once it breaks, it cannot be repaired. Rome followed the same path. Obedience creates stability, but stability does not mean immortality, and when change is needed, no one knows how. And this is the greatest irony in the entire story of the Roman Empire, something the textbooks never say outright. From the 3rd century to the 5th century, the Roman Empire crumbled piece by piece. Not because of a single defeat, but because it had lost the ability to innovate anything at all. Germanic tribes poured in from the north, and Rome had no new strategic thinking to counter them, only outdated tactics that no longer worked. The very thing that had kept Rome alive, Greek knowledge, was the very thing they had spent centuries trying to suppress and control. So here's the summary. Rome designed an education system with one single purpose: to produce obedient citizens. And it worked. The greatest empire of the ancient world was born. Millions lived under one legal code. Thousands of kilometers of roads were built. It worked so well that no one in the empire thought it could ever fail. Obedience looked like strength until it became a weakness. But that very obedience killed the empire. The thing that built Rome was also the thing that destroyed Rome. That is the greatest paradox of this story. No one dared ask why. So no one knew what needed to change. No one dared to doubt, so no one saw the problem until it was too late. When the world outside changes, there are only two choices: adapt or collapse. Rome didn't know how to adapt, so Rome collapsed. Not because they lacked soldiers, not because they lacked money, not because they lacked territory, but because they lacked something far simpler: the ability to think. And if you think this story belongs only to the past, think again, because many modern education systems also prioritize obedience and test scores. There are students at the top of their class who memorize every lesson from start to finish, who score the highest marks, yet don't dare raise their hand to ask the teacher why. Modern exams measure how much you can remember, not whether you can come up with something new. That is the biggest problem of all. The system produces followers. But the question is, who will lead when the old road ends, and who will draw a new map when the old one has lost its value? The history of Rome is not just a lesson from the past, it is a warning to every education system that exists in the world today. But amid that collapse, Marcus Aurelius still sat writing meditations on the battlefield, and free thinking still lived on in the pages of his book. He is living proof that even within the most rigid system, even beneath the thickest shell of obedience, free thinking still finds a way to survive. The question is, what kind of people is our education system producing obedient citizens or human beings who dare to ask new questions? Every classroom, every exam, every rule, every time you tell a child to sit still and obey, you are answering that question without even knowing it. Rome didn't need science classes, they needed obedience. And that is exactly why an empire that lasted over 1,000 years ultimately collapsed.